evening sun, this sinking low, a few more days, and I must go to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. Please be seated. Good to see everybody here tonight. As I mentioned this morning, next Sunday night, Josh will be giving the sermon, and he will incorporate a presentation of his trip to Romania a couple of weeks ago into his presentation. So I expect you to be here next Sunday night anyway, but I hope you anticipate that and pray for Josh and his work. I don't know if I ever explained how we got in contact with Josh. Several years ago, I brought up the idea that Swartz Creek should sponsor our own missionary. Rachel and I were involved with churches that had few missionaries, which meant they could put a lot of energy into our work. Prayers, money, energy. And I just think that's a great thing to do. And so we batted that around, not knowing where it was going to go. And then one day, Jewel was home from Fried-Hardeman for a holiday break. I was sitting on the couch reading, which is what I always do. And she and Rachel and Anna were in the kitchen, and Jewel happened to mention that she has a friend from Fried-Hardeman that was in Romania. It was the summertime. She was home for the summer. She said she knew of a friend that was in Romania. And just because I'm reading doesn't mean I don't know what's going on. Okay, so I hear Romania, and my flag goes up. And I'm like, what? Tell me what's going on. And she told me his name, and so I stalked him on Facebook. Found out that he was in Romania and where he was going. So then I sent a private message, and I said, I'm Paul Holland, former missionary to Romania. What's going on? What are you doing there? Are you interested in being a long-term missionary? And he messaged back, not knowing who I was, knowing I was Jewel's father. But anyway, he said, yeah, I think I'd be interested. And that's where it got started. And then you might remember he came up for 3 weeks during the holidays a couple of years ago to do a 3-week internship with us, and it gave the elders an opportunity to get to know him better and so forth. And of course, then he moved up here. And the elders have created a list of things to expect out of Josh. I wish I had had a former missionary working with me full-time before I went over there to help us have a better idea of what to expect. And so that's what we've been doing with Josh since he moved up here several years ago. And Josh has been meeting the elders' expectations and exceeding them in many ways. Now, when we went over there, and I'm sharing this, but Josh already knows it, but when he went over there, he went over with one of our former team members, Darren, who preaches in Texas. And so I asked Darren, I said, tell me what you think of Josh. Because he planned this whole trip by himself. I said, tell me what you think of Josh. And so he wrote back, and he wrote something to share with Mark and Todd and me, and he had really good things to say about Josh. The one thing he said that Josh needed to work on was that he needed more experience. Which reminds me of the man who was appointed to be the new president of a bank. And he met with the outgoing president. He said, tell me what I can do to be a good bank president. And the man says, well, you need to make wise decisions. And the young man said, I understand that, so what do I need to do in order to make wise decisions? And the outgoing president said, you need to make bad decisions. You gain wisdom by making bad decisions, right? Obviously having advisors along the way too. So I hope you're here and you support Josh and you listen to what he has to say. You pray for him this summer, and it looks like he'll be leaving us this fall so he can spend the holidays with his parents before he moves over there. sometime early next year. And then we'll pray that he can lead people to the gospel, to Jesus Christ. So that's next Sunday night. And then after services, again, is our Last of Leaders banquet. How can we overemphasize how important it is to encourage these young people? Rachel heard the young ladies do their speeches, and I heard some of the young men do their speeches. Can't hear all of them because they are scheduled at the same time. And so if you've got young men, for example, who are giving speeches, I can only pick a few of them to go to, whoever's in the same room. Okay, so I don't get to hear all of them. But they just put in a lot of effort, and we commend the parents for the time that they've spent with them, because a lot of this stuff is done at home, and it's been encouraging. And I mentioned 17,000 people were registered for the lads' conventions a couple of weekends. 17,000. And that's just in the United States. Romania has its own Lads of Leaders convention. And they've been putting pictures on Facebook. And so we're doing the church. If you ever get discouraged about what's going on in the church, you need to go to things like this. And you see where the energy is, where people are teaching the next generation and training them. So stay around, bring a dish. The list is around. It's easy for Ken to point to it with his thumb because his thumb is so crooked, but it's around the corner there, the list of food to bring to the banquet next week. And stay and listen to what these kids are doing. Let's get into our study tonight. In John chapter 10 and verse 10, Jesus promises his apostles that he came to give us an abundant life. Thank you for turning to John 10, but we're not going there. You could turn to Luke 10 if you want to turn to anywhere. Luke chapter 10. So Jesus promised us that he came to give us an abundant life. And that's not just referring to eternal life. That's also referring to an abundant life here in this world. And the focus of the lesson tonight is the abundant life requires selflessness, unselfishness. Lawrence Edward Grace Oates was a British explorer and a member of Robert Falcon Scott's failed expedition to explore the South Pole back in the early 20th century. So the group was returning from the South Pole when an awful blizzard struck the group. Now, Oates' feet became severely frostbitten, and it began to turn into gangrene. And he begged his group to leave him behind because he was just slowing them down to get back to safety. And his team obviously refused to hear of it. So they struggled on for another day. And they set up their camp. The next morning, the blizzard was still going strong. And Oates told his friends that he needed to go outside for just a short time. But they never saw him again. He intentionally gave up his life so his team would quit dragging their feet for his sake in getting back to safety. Luke chapter 10. This religious leader asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" And he said, well, there's a man that was walking down the road, and he gets waylaid, beaten, robbed, and left for dead. One religious man comes along, and he sees this guy laying on the ground, and he goes by on the other side. A second religious man comes along and sees this guy laying on the ground. He doesn't know if the robbers are still in the area, so he passes by also on the other side. And then this Samaritan, the person that you really would not expect to be a good person to a Jew, this Samaritan comes along, and he sees him, and he has compassion on him. and he binds up his wounds. Using wine to purify and oil as a bandage. Puts him on his donkey, carries him to the inn, pays for his service. Tells the innkeeper, whatever you spend with this guy, when I come back, I'll reimburse you for it. This story illustrates the two attitudes that I'm talking about tonight. On one hand, we've got selfishness that is found in the religious men who mistreated the guy. Unselfishness from the Samaritan who treated him. Selfishness from those two men that creates trouble in the life of this innocent man. Unselfishness found a cure for his pain and his suffering. Selfishness takes from others and creates less good. Unselfishness gives to others, and it makes more. Selfishness certainly makes men smaller in their character, but unselfishness makes men bigger in their character. Now, if I were to ask, do any of you not need to work on being unselfish? In other words, would anybody raise your hand and say, I am as unselfish as I need to be? If you were to do that, I'd say, well, next Sunday night I'll be preaching on humility. Don't we all need to work on being more unselfish? That's a part of the abundant life. Look at some of these scriptures that I'm going to put on the screen. You might already know what the scriptures say. First one is Matthew 22 and verse 39. While you're turning there, I'm speaking at the men's retreat, as I mentioned this morning, at the end of this month. 6 lessons I've got to give in 2 days. I'm speaking 5 places outside of Swartz Creek this year. Now, I'll only be gone, 3 Sundays for those 5 times. And I'm giving 28 sermons. I'm speaking 28 times in those 5 places. So the men's retreat is 6 of those. The gospel meeting a couple of weeks ago, that was 6. Next month, I speak at the Bad Acts lectureship on Jesus and the minor prophets. So I'll be speaking on Jesus and Hosea and Jesus and Zechariah. In August, I speak at Polishing the Pulpit, and the title of one of my lessons is Life in 3 Verses. Life in 3 verses. Well, you can go anywhere with that. What is life in 3 verses? I'm going to look at this text, Matthew. Actually, I'm not going to look at Matthew 22:39. I'm going to look at Mark's account in Mark chapter 12. But I'm directing your attention to Matthew chapter 22 and verse 39. This is the context where the lawyer comes to Jesus and says, what is the greatest commandment? The Jews had counted up 613 laws in the law of Moses because the Jews were very careful about making copies of the law exactly. And so they counted everything. They knew how many words were on a page, how many letters were in a line. They counted everything. And so they counted 613 laws. 365 negative laws and 200, whatever the difference is, of positive laws. So this lawyer comes to Jesus. He says, what's the greatest commandment? What's the one thing that God expects out of us? And you know what he said? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love God with all of your essence. Verse 39. Unselfishness. If somebody would ask me and you what's the greatest law in the law of Moses, I don't think any of us would go to Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18. How many of us skip the book of Leviticus when we read through the Bible? Jesus pointed to Leviticus 19:18. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's law number 2. Out of all the laws, this law requires unselfishness. How about the next point? The golden rule. You don't have to look up Matthew 7 and verse 12 to know the golden rule, do you? The non-Christians in our country know the golden rule. They live by it if they're on the receiving end of it. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The Jewish rabbis said, don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. Well, that's not good. Because in essence, what that says is don't do anything. That allows me to do nothing. But Jesus' law doesn't allow me to do nothing. It requires me to do something. Do to others what you want them to do to you. So the golden rule requires unselfishness. How about James 1 and verse 27? Do you know what James 1:27 says? I kind of give you a hint, don't I? Jesus says, this is the essence of pure and undefiled religion. What is the essence of Christianity? Pure and undefiled religion is to visit the orphans and the widows. That is the essence of Christianity. And of course, we all understand, I think, that the word visit here doesn't mean we step inside the door, say, how are you doing, and we leave. The word visit here carries the connotation of doing something, serving orphans and widows. So pure and undefiled religion requires unselfishness. How about Galatians 6 and verse 10? So I'm going to let you find time to look it up, because if you don't have these verses written down in your Bible somewhere, highlighted, circled, or whatever, here's your opportunity to do it. Here is Jesus' teachings on unselfishness. If you want to have an abundant life, Galatians 6 and verse 10. Do good to everybody, especially to those who are of the household of the faith. Now, the word faith here in the original language has "the" in front of it, which means he's referring to people who are connected to the gospel, the faith of the gospel, so Christians. So do good to all men, but especially to Christians. That requires unselfishness. How about Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4? Philippians 2 and verse 4. If you don't know what it says off the top of your head, you need to look it up. Philippians 2 and verse 4. Verse 5 begins one of the most beautiful and important songs. Most scholars believe the next several verses are a song about the nature of Jesus Christ. But Philippians 2 is not about the nature of Jesus Christ, even though it is about the nature of Jesus Christ. Philippians chapter 2 is about not thinking about yourself, but thinking about other people. That's unselfishness. So the character that Jesus requires of us, that beautifies us in the eyes of God, requires unselfishness. We go on with a few other verses. In 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 15. Some of these other verses are well known. I'm just going to guess that you probably don't know what 2 Corinthians 12 verse 15 says, just because it's not one of the more popular verses that we tend to use. But Paul says, I would gladly spend and be spent for you. When I tell people Sunday morning, when I extend the invitation and I say, if you want to study the Bible, I'm here to study the Bible with you. A lot of you will say, Paul, I know you're busy and you don't have time for me. That's not true. You are my time. We as ministers, me, Jared, Josh, we want to spend and be spent for you. If we can study, if we can encourage, if we can pray, whatever it is we need to do, we're here to do it for you. That was Paul's attitude there, 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 15. Selflessness. Matthew 20, verse 28. We got two verses from Matthew chapter 20. We'll go in reverse order, Matthew 20 and verse 28. Take a look at what Jesus says there. Jesus says, I did not come to be served. I came to serve. He didn't sit down in that upper room waiting for his disciples to come wash his feet. He took up his towel and he went to wash their feet. And if the Son of God could stoop so low as to do a job that was reserved for slaves, then I suspect we can also too. But now I'm talking to myself as much as I'm talking to you. Look at verse 27. If you want to be first, you've got to be last. And slave of all. You see, family, the essence of Christianity is unselfishness. We're familiar with the words of Jesus that are not recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Paul quotes in Acts 20 and verse 35, it is more blessed to give than to receive. And so if we want to make the most of life, if we want to live that abundant life, then we need to pray. Oh Lord, I pray that for this day I may not swerve by foot or hand from thy command not to be served, but to serve. That is the essence of Christianity. The Dead Sea is stagnant and unattractive compared to normal bodies of water because there is no outlet for the Dead Sea. The Sea of Galilee is in the north. It flows into the Dead Sea by the Jordan River, and then water goes nowhere else. In other words, the Dead Sea receives, and it receives, and it receives, but it never gives. And so, like the Dead Sea, a self-centered life is only a dead life. Thomas Gibbons wrote that man may last but never lives, who much receives but nothing gives, whom none can love, whom none can thank, creation's blot, creation's blank. Seneca, the Roman philosopher, said, no man can live happily who regards himself alone, who turns everything to his own advantage. Thou must live for another, if thou wish to live for thyself. That's wise words coming from a non-Christian. If you want to live, you can't live for yourself. Frederick William Faber wrote, oh, I could go through all life's trouble singing, turning earth's night to day, if self were not so fast around me clinging to all you or say. How much do we go through life thinking about self? How often do our words reflect self? The selfish person is incapable really of true friendship. Because friendship cannot exist one direction. A person is a false friend as long as he can make something of us, receive something from us. It's like those who sought Jesus, he says in John chapter 6, just for the loaves and the fish. That's all they wanted out of Jesus. They didn't want to give him their allegiance. They just wanted to feed themselves. That individual will use us to help himself financially, to climb socially, to enhance their own image, to help them and their family, to satisfy their own ego. But if you need their help, you find out that they're not a friend. They're just exploiters. The self-absorbed individual has a weak character. He goes whichever way the wind goes, east, west, north, or south, depending on whatever his self-interests are at that moment. He can play both sides of the street. He works both ends against the middle. The stuff he feeds you is hard to stomach. When you learn who he is, he's too thick for a spoon and too thin for a fork. He's brave when there's no fight because it's just all about opportunism. Vengeful satisfaction, he could secretly knife you in the back if that's what it takes to get him ahead. And you may have people that you work with like that. Their decisions are not based on right and wrong, but on the grounds of how it's going to affect them, even though he pretends like it's selfless. King Solomon writes in Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 21, "For a piece of bread that man will transgress." He'll sin against God for just a bite of bread for himself. He longs to fill big shoes, and when he gets the chance, his own selfishness shrinks him to such littleness that he can barely see out of the shoes. So, the unselfish. You know, there are no great men and women except those who give themselves to help others. The secret of their bigness is found in the bigness of their hearts. So unselfishness is humility. Selfishness is pride. Unselfishness is forgiving. Selfishness is about pride and holding grudges. Unselfishness is sincere, not controlled by selfish motives, hospitable. There's an interest in others. Unselfishness is charitable, that is loving, feeling for others, like the Good Samaritan, having compassion for others. Unselfishness is tolerant. Unselfishness means I can see things from the other person's perspective, or at least I try to see things from the other person's perspective. That's unselfishness. Unselfishness is friendly. Makes us outgoing and want to encourage others. Unselfishness is joyful. Selfishness is unhappiness. Unselfishness is being adjusted. Adjusting to the people around us. And that makes us forget ourselves. Unselfishness is beautiful. As we say sometimes, pretty is as pretty does. Unselfish people are beautiful to be around. Beautiful to look at. Now that table that I just showed you there looks a lot like Paul's description of love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Because Paul says love does not seek its own. It's unselfish. So I want to conclude with just a handful of some suggestions that might help us to think more seriously about being selfish. First of all, be a better listener. Be a better listener. Too many of us assume that we know what the other person is going to say, and then we interrupt them, or we start thinking about what we're going to say in response. And Proverbs 18 and verse 13, King Solomon says, "He who answers a matter before he hears it is folly to him." Be a good listener. Number two, we need to examine our own assumptions about other people's words and behavior. We can't read people's minds, and we don't know their motivations. So we have to be careful what we assume. We need to give them the benefit of the doubt, and we need to ask questions if we're confused. Number 3, we've got to commit ourselves to serving. And serving does not necessarily come easy. Serving comes easy for some people. It doesn't necessarily come easy for everybody. Serving is a decision that we have to make. I need to stop what I'm doing and serve. Number 4, we need to learn how to compromise. We're not going to agree with everybody on everything. Unselfishness means we learn how to compromise. We learn to work towards an agreement that makes both of us satisfied with our decisions. And number 5, we've got to let other people make their own decisions. We have to let other people make their own decisions. That's unselfishness. Because all of us are free, moral people. And we have the right to make our own decisions. God allows people to make their own decisions as much as it pains Him. And we need to do the same. Number 6, we need to practice looking at an issue from the other person's perspective. Every time we have a disagreement, we should ask the other person, what's your perspective? Let me try to understand it. And number 7, show interest in and celebrate others. The Apostle Paul encourages Christians, rejoice with those who rejoice. That's celebrating other people's accomplishments. Even if I think I deserve that accomplishment or I put more into it, they got the recognition, let me celebrate with them. And if I have a hard time doing that, let me pray about it and ask God to help me be unselfish. The abundant life is a life that Jesus calls us to give our lives in service to others. To give our lives in service to Him supremely, but in service to others sacrificially. We need to practice this selflessness in our attitude, in our thinkings, in our words, and our actions, so we can be like Christ. Can we encourage you further tonight? Can we pray for you? Can we help you in any way? The elders stand ready to help. Let us know if we can while we stand and sing.
He will come.